The millionaire's son cruelly humiliated an elderly farmer. However, he was paralyzed when a young man identical to him stepped in then. Ethan and Caroline sat in the sleek office of Dr. Meyers, the fertility specialist they had been consulting for years. The walls were lined with photos of smiling families, newborns wrapped in blankets, and grateful notes from couples whose dreams had come true. But for Ethan and Caroline, the dream had turned into a nightmare of endless tests, treatments, and disappointments. "I'm sorry," Dr. Meyers said gently, her hands clasped on the desk. "We've exhausted all viable options. The chances of you conceiving naturally or through assisted means are close to zero." Caroline's breath hitched as she gripped Ethan's hand, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his skin. Ethan, always the steady one, squeezed back, though his jaw tightened imperceptibly. He had prepared himself for this, but hearing it aloud still felt like a blow to the chest. The room seemed to shrink around them, the weight of her words suffocating. I just don't understand," Caroline stammered, her voice trembling. "We've done everything, every procedure, every injection, every trial." "I know," Dr. Meyers interrupted softly. "Sometimes, even when the science is perfect, nature has its own plans." As they walked to their car, the silence between them felt heavier than ever. Charleston's historic streets, with their grand oak trees and pastel-colored mansions, passed in a blur as Ethan drove home. Caroline finally broke the silence, her voice small but determined. "What if adoption is the answer? Maybe this is how we're meant to have a family." Ethan glanced at her, his grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. They had brushed on the topic of adoption before, but it always seemed like a distant, last resort option. "Are you sure, Caroline? It's a big step." Her eyes, still glistening with unshed tears, met his. "I've never been more sure. We want a child to love." "Ethan, does it really matter how they come into our lives?" Ethan sighed, his usual pragmatic demeanor softening as he reached over to take her hand. "No, it doesn't. Let's do it." 2 months later, Ethan and Caroline walked into St. Mary's orphanage, their steps hesitant but filled with hope. The cheerful sound of children playing echoed through the halls, their laughter bringing an odd sense of optimism. A kindly nun greeted them warmly and led them down a corridor filled with artwork, tiny handprints, and smiling faces. The nun opened a door to a sunlit playroom where children of all ages were engaged in various activities. "This is where we spend most of our afternoons," she explained. "It's a space for them to feel safe and happy." Ethan and Caroline scanned the room, their hearts pounding as they watched the children play. That's when their eyes landed on 2 boys, no older than 2, sitting side by side on a colorful rug. One was stacking blocks with meticulous focus, his little brow furrowed in concentration. The other, his mirror image, giggled mischievously as he knocked over the stack. "They're twins," the nun explained, her voice soft with affection. "Their parents passed away in a car accident. It's been difficult for them, but they've always had each other." Ethan crouched down, his eyes level with the boy who was rebuilding the tower. "Hey there, buddy, what's your name?" The boy blinked at him. Clutching a block tightly, his brother, curious and less shy, toddled over to Caroline and plopped into her lap as if he belonged there. Caroline froze, overwhelmed by the warmth of the tiny body leaning against her. Her heart, heavy with years of longing, felt as if it might burst. "These are Lucas and Ryan," the nun continued. "They've been inseparable since birth." "We'll adopt them both," Caroline said, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. Ethan looked at her, his own eyes misty, and nodded. The boys had already stolen their hearts. The adoption process was long and, at times, grueling. But Ethan's influence as a wealthy businessman helped expedite things. Within weeks, Lucas and Ryan officially became Valenza's, their home. A sprawling mansion with manicured gardens and rooms that seemed endless, transformed overnight into a lively haven filled with laughter and the sound of tiny feet. Caroline threw herself into creating the perfect nursery. She spent hours choosing soft, plush toys, painting the walls a calming blue, and filling bookshelves with colorful stories. Ethan, who rarely took time off work, surprised her by assembling the cribs himself, determined to make the room just right for their boys. The twins brought chaos and joy in equal measure, Lucas, ever the explorer, climbed onto anything he could find, often giving Caroline a mini heart attack as she rushed to catch him. Ryan, quieter and more reserved, observed everything with wide, curious eyes before cautiously joining in. Despite their differences, the bond between them was undeniable. One evening, as the family gathered on the patio overlooking their meticulously landscaped garden, Caroline watched the twins chase each other under the fading golden light. "This feels like a dream," she said softly, leaning against Ethan. He wrapped an arm around her, his voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. "For the first time in years, I feel whole." The boys' laughter filled the air as Lucas toppled into Ryan, and they both fell into a giggling heap. The scene was perfect, almost too perfect, unbeknownst to them. This fleeting moment of peace was a fragile bubble, ready to burst. The following year was nothing short of magical. Lucas and Ryan grew into lively, curious toddlers who filled every corner of the Valenza mansion with joy. The boys had an uncanny way of complementing each other. Lucas was bold and adventurous, always climbing or exploring, while Ryan was quieter, the careful observer who often followed his brother's lead. Ethan and Caroline had settled into their new roles as parents with ease. Ethan, who had once been consumed by business deals and late nights at the office, now found himself rushing home to read bedtime stories or play hide-and-seek. Caroline, who had once felt the hollow ache of an empty home, now woke up to the sound of tiny footsteps padding down the hall, her heart full. Their days were filled with milestones. Lucas taking his first shaky steps across the nursery while Ryan cheered him on, or Ryan muttering his first word, "Mama," which sent Caroline into a whirlwind of tears and laughter. Every moment felt like a victory, a reminder of how far they had come. When the 4th of July arrived, the family decided to celebrate at the annual Charleston Festival. It was a tradition in the city, a vibrant event filled with food stands, live music, and, of course, the grand fireworks display over the harbor. Ethan thought it was the perfect opportunity to introduce the twins to the festivities and create memories that would last a lifetime. The festival was as lively as ever. Families strolled along the waterfront. Children waved sparklers in the air, and the scent of roasted peanuts and funnel cakes wafted through the warm summer breeze. Lucas and Ryan were mesmerized by the sights and sounds, their little hands clutching balloons as they darted from one booth to another, squealing with delight. Caroline couldn't stop smiling as she watched Ethan crouch to take a photo with the twins in front of a giant American flag backdrop. "Say cheese," he called, his voice light and carefree. "Cheese," Lucas yelled, his grin wide and mischievous. Ryan, quieter as usual, simply leaned against his brother, his smile soft but genuine. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan suggested they find a good spot for the fireworks. The crowd had thickened, and the bustling energy of the festival grew louder. Caroline held tightly to Lucas's hand, while Ethan guided Ryan through the throng, weaving between families and vendors. "Over there," Ethan pointed to a patch of grass near the water. "We'll have a great view," as they settled in. The first firework shot into the sky, bursting into a dazzling array of colors. Lucas clapped his hands, his face lighting up with wonder. Ryan sat quietly, his wide eyes fixed on the sky. Entranced by the display, Caroline leaned into Ethan, feeling the warmth of the moment. "This is perfect," she whispered. Ethan nodded, his arm wrapped protectively around her. "It really is. But perfection, as they would soon learn, is often fleeting." Amidst the booming fireworks and the cheers of the crowd, Lucas tugged at Caroline's hand. "Mama, candy," he said, pointing to a nearby stand selling cotton candy. Caroline smiled. "All right, sweetheart. Let's go get some." She turned to Ethan. "We'll be right back." Ethan nodded, his focus still on Ryan, who had started to fidget nervously at the sound of the louder fireworks. "Stay close," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of caution. Caroline and Lucas wove through the crowd toward the stand. It only took a few minutes to buy the treat, but when they returned to the patch of grass where they had left Ethan and Ryan, they found it empty. Her heart skipped a beat. "Ethan," she called, scanning the sea of faces around her. "Ryan." She spotted Ethan a few yards away, frantically looking in every direction. "Ethan, what's going on?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. I don't know," Ethan stammered, his face pale. I looked away for just a second, and Ryan, he was right here. He was right here. Caroline's grip on Lucas tightened as her eyes darted around the crowd. "Ryan!" she shouted, her voice rising above the chaos. "Ryan, where are you?" But the crowd was too dense, the noise too overwhelming. The laughter and chatter of the festival suddenly felt suffocating. Minutes turned into an agonizing hour as they searched every corner of the festival grounds, asking vendors and passers-by if they had seen a little boy in a striped shirt. The answers were always the same. No. By the time the fireworks finale lit up the sky, the Valenza's world had already shattered. Ryan was gone. The police were called, and the festival organizers quickly mobilized volunteers to help search the area. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Caroline clung to Lucas, who was now silent and confused, while Ethan paced back and forth, his hands trembling. "We'll find him," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "We'll find him." But as the hours dragged on and the festival grounds emptied, hope began to wane. The once bright night now felt unbearably dark. By dawn, the search had yielded nothing. Exhausted and broken, Ethan and Caroline returned home with only one of their sons. Lucas, too young to understand the magnitude of what had happened, simply asked, "Where's Ryan?" Caroline's breath caught in her throat as tears streamed down her face. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice hollow. "We'll figure it out," he said, though neither of them believed it. For the Valenzas, the dream of their perfect family had turned into a waking nightmare. The days following Ryan's disappearance were a blur for Ethan and Caroline. Their once lively home, filled with the sounds of laughter and play, now felt like a hollow shell. Every corner of the mansion seemed to echo with the absence of the little boy they had lost. Caroline barely slept, her mind replaying the moments before Ryan vanished, wondering if there was something, anything, she could have done differently. Ethan, ever the pragmatic one, threw himself into action. He hired private investigators, distributed flyers, and offered a substantial reward for any information leading to Ryan's return. But days turned into weeks, and the silence became unbearable. Every lead the investigators followed turned into a dead end. Each phone call brought a surge of hope, only to crush it moments later. "I can't do this anymore, Ethan," Caroline whispered one night as they sat together in the living room, their untouched dinner plates sitting cold on the table. Her voice was barely audible, weighed down by exhaustion and grief. "I can't keep waking up every day hoping he'll walk through the door." Ethan looked at her, his own eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. "We can't give up, Caroline. He's out there, I know it." Caroline shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "And what about Lucas? He's still here, Ethan. He needs us. He needs a family that isn't broken." Ethan's jaw tightened. He hated the idea of giving up. But Caroline was right. Lucas was too young to understand what had happened. But even at 2 years old, he could sense the tension in the air. He had started clinging to Caroline, his little hands gripping her shirt as if afraid she might disappear too. After a month of fruitless searching, Ethan and Caroline made a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They agreed to stop the public search and focus on Lucas. They told the private investigators to continue working quietly, but decided not to let the outside world, or Lucas, know what had happened. "We'll protect him," Ethan said firmly as they stood in the nursery, now stripped of all traces of Ryan. "We'll make sure he doesn't grow up with this pain." Caroline nodded, though the words felt like knives in her chest. "But what if he remembers? What if he asks about Ryan?" Ethan placed his hands on her shoulders, looking into her tear-filled eyes. "We'll say he never had a brother. He's too young to remember." "It's the only way, Caroline." As the years passed, the Valenzas became masters of their own facade. Lucas grew into a bright, cheerful child, blissfully unaware of the secret his parents carried. Ethan and Caroline dedicated themselves to creating a stable, loving home for him, pouring all their energy into giving him a life free of pain and sorrow. Lucas loved exploring the mansion's sprawling gardens, often playing hide-and-seek with the house staff. He was fascinated by airplanes, spending hours drawing pictures of them, and dreaming of one day becoming a pilot. His curiosity and enthusiasm were a source of light for Ethan and Caroline, who clung to these moments as a lifeline. Still, there were cracks in the surface. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Caroline would sit in the nursery, now converted into a guest room, and run her fingers over the faint outlines of Ryan's name, etched into the wooden crib. Ethan, meanwhile, buried himself in his work, avoiding conversations that might bring the pain rushing back. Their grief became a quiet, unspoken burden, always present but never addressed. One evening, when Lucas was around 6 years old, he came across an old photo album tucked away in a closet. He brought it to Caroline, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Mom, who's this?" he asked, pointing to a picture of himself as a baby, but with another toddler by his side. Caroline froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been so careful to remove all traces of Ryan from their home, but this photo had slipped through the cracks. Her mind raced as she tried to come up with an explanation. That's you, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile. "It's just an old picture from when you were little." Lucas furrowed his brow. "But it looks like there's two of me." Caroline's throat tightened. "It's just a trick of the camera, darling. Sometimes pictures look funny like that." Satisfied with her answer, Lucas nodded and skipped off to play. Caroline let out a shaky breath, clutching the album to her chest. She knew the day would come when the questions would get harder to deflect. But for now, she could only hope the truth would remain buried. Despite their efforts to move forward, Ethan and Caroline couldn't escape the weight of their decision. On Ryan's birthday each year, they lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill, a quiet tribute to the son they had lost. They never spoke of it aloud, but the ritual became a small way of keeping his memory alive. As Lucas grew older, he began to notice the subtle tension that sometimes clouded his parents' smiles. He didn't understand it, but he could feel it, like a shadow lurking in the corners of their otherwise happy home. He would occasionally catch his mother staring out the window with a faraway look in her eyes, or find his father sitting in his study, lost in thought. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked one evening as he found her wiping away a tear in the kitchen. Caroline smiled weakly, ruffling his hair. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." Lucas accepted her answer, but the image stayed with him. Even at 8 years old, he could sense that there was something his parents weren't telling him. The secret, though buried deep, remained like a ticking time bomb, waiting for the day it would finally explode. Years passed, and the Valenzas seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Lucas grew into a confident, sharp young man. The center of his parents' world, Ethan and Caroline had done everything in their power to ensure he had a happy, fulfilling childhood, but the shadow of their loss lingered in quiet, unspoken ways. Lucas had no memory of Ryan, and Ethan and Caroline worked tirelessly to keep it that way. Every family photo had been carefully curated. Every casual conversation meticulously monitored. It was their unspoken pact. Protect Lucas from the truth, no matter the cost. By the time Lucas turned 22, he had grown into a striking young man, full of energy and ambition. He was charismatic and quick-witted, traits that made him a natural at navigating social circles, while his charm won him admiration. It was his sharp business instincts that impressed Ethan the most. Lucas had recently joined the family business, shadowing Ethan in preparation to one day take over the Valenza empire. Ethan took pride in his son's drive. Lucas had inherited his tenacity and knack for negotiation, traits that Ethan believed would make him an exceptional leader. But he also saw shades of Ryan in Lucas, the way he tilted his head when deep in thought, the quiet kindness that sometimes slipped through his otherwise confident demeanor. It was a bittersweet reminder of the son they had lost. Caroline, on the other hand, often worried about Lucas's overconfidence. "He's smart, Ethan," she said one evening as they sat in the living room, "but he's young. He doesn't always think things through. He'll learn," Ethan replied, sipping his whiskey. "He's got good instincts. He just needs experience." Caroline sighed, watching her husband with a mixture of love and exasperation. "Just don't push him too hard. He's still finding his way." That summer, Ethan proposed a trip to Greenville, South Carolina, to finalize a land deal for the expansion of their real estate ventures. Greenville was a charming town known for its rolling hills and picturesque downtown, but it was also home to a cluster of valuable properties that Ethan had been eyeing for years. "I want you to come with me," Ethan told Lucas one morning over breakfast. "This is the kind of deal that'll teach you how to think strategically. It's not just numbers on a page. It's about understanding people, reading the room." Lucas leaned back in his chair, a sly grin spreading across his face. "You mean you need me to charm them, right?" Ethan chuckled. "Something like that." Caroline, overhearing from the kitchen, chimed in. Just promise me you'll stay out of trouble. Greenville might not be Charleston, but small towns have their own way of doing things. Trouble, Lucas smirked. When have I ever caused trouble? Ethan raised an eyebrow, exchanging a knowing glance with Caroline. Let's not make a list. The drive to Greenville was uneventful, the winding roads lined with lush greenery and scattered farms. Lucas gazed out the window, idly flipping through his phone. He was used to the fast-paced energy of Charleston, and Greenville already felt worlds away from the life he knew. When they arrived, Ethan wasted no time setting up meetings with the local property owners. Lucas tagged along, observing his father's methodical approach to negotiations. Ethan was a master of control, balancing charm and pressure to get what he wanted without ever seeming forceful. Lucas studied every move. Eager to prove himself, by the second day, the Valenzas had made significant progress, securing agreements from most of the landowners. But one property, a sprawling farm just outside town, remained elusive. Its owner, a stubborn older man named Mr. Carter, had refused to sell despite multiple offers. "We'll meet him tomorrow," Ethan said as they left a cafe downtown. "I want you to handle the introductions. He'll probably respond better to someone younger." Lucas nodded, eager for the challenge. "I'll make sure he can't say no." That evening, as they walked back to their car, they passed a group of locals gathered outside a small bar. Lucas, always drawn to the energy of a crowd, paused to watch. The laughter and chatter were infectious, and before Ethan could stop him, Lucas had joined the group, striking up a conversation. "Looks like a tourist," one of the men muttered, loud enough for Lucas to hear. The comment was laced with condescension, and Lucas, never one to back down, turned with a confident grin. "Not a tourist," he replied smoothly. "Just here on business." The man, a burly figure in his mid-40s, crossed his arms. "Business, huh? Let me guess. Buying up the town so you can slap condos on it." Lucas laughed, his tone light but sharp. "Something like that. But don't worry. We'll keep it classy." The tension in the air was palpable as the man took a step closer. "You think this is funny? People like you don't belong here." Before Lucas could respond, another voice cut through the crowd. "That's enough." Lucas turned, and his heart nearly stopped. Standing there was a young man his age, the same height, the same build, with features so familiar it was like looking into a mirror. The crowd fell silent as the two stared at each other, their identical faces reflecting shock and confusion. "Who?" Lucas began, but the stranger held up a hand, his expression unreadable. "Let's not make this worse," the man said, addressing the group. "He's not worth it." Without another word, the crowd dispersed, leaving Lucas standing frozen. The stranger gave him one last glance before disappearing into the shadows. When Lucas recounted the incident to Ethan later that night, his father's face went pale. "Are you sure?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad," Lucas said, his voice tinged with frustration. "He looked exactly like me. It wasn't just similar, it was identical." Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't let Lucas see the panic that had gripped him, but the truth was undeniable. This wasn't just a coincidence. The past he and Caroline had worked so hard to bury was finally catching up to them. Ethan hardly slept that night. The image of Lucas recounting the incident with the stranger, someone identical to him, played on a loop in his mind. He had spent years burying the truth. Crafting a life where Ryan's disappearance no longer lingered like a ghost over their family. And now, in the small, quiet town of Greenville, everything was unraveling. The next morning, Ethan was uncharacteristically quiet as he and Lucas prepared for their meeting with Mr. Carter. Lucas, still rattled by the encounter, couldn't stop replaying it in his head. The stranger's face, his voice, even the way he moved. It was like looking in a mirror. But how could that be possible? "You okay, Dad?" Lucas finally asked as they got into the car. Ethan nodded stiffly, keeping his eyes on the road. "I'm fine. Just focused on the meeting." Lucas didn't press further. Though he couldn't shake the feeling that his father was hiding something, Ethan wasn't usually one to let anything rattle him. But today, there was an undeniable tension in the air. The meeting with Mr. Carter was predictably challenging. The older man was stubborn and deeply attached to his land. Despite the generous offers on the table, Ethan led the conversation with his usual blend of charm and logic. But Lucas could tell it wasn't working. Mr. Carter wasn't swayed by numbers or promises. After an hour of back and forth, the meeting ended without a deal. As they walked back to the car, Lucas could sense Ethan's frustration. "You want me to give it a shot tomorrow?" Lucas asked, half joking. Maybe he just needs some youthful persuasion. Ethan chuckled dryly, though the humor didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see." That evening, Lucas couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him since the encounter with the stranger. He decided to walk through Greenville's small downtown area, hoping to clear his head. The streets were quiet, lined with charming brick buildings and string lights that twinkled in the twilight. As he turned a corner, he spotted the same bar from the night before. Against his better judgment, he decided to step inside. The warm glow of the interior was inviting, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Lucas scanned the room, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the stranger sitting at the far end of the bar, nursing a drink. Lucas hesitated for a moment before walking over. "Hey," he said, his voice steady but curious. "I think we need to talk." The stranger looked up, his expression guarded. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. It wasn't just similar, it was uncanny. Lucas felt like he was staring at an alternate version of himself. "What do you want?" the man asked, his tone flat. Lucas pulled out the bar stool next to him and sat down. "I don't know," he admitted, "but you can't tell me this doesn't feel weird." The man sighed, swirling his drink before taking a sip. "It's not my problem if you think we look alike. Maybe it's just a coincidence." "Coincidence," Lucas repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You're kidding, right? We look exactly the same." "That's not a coincidence." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set his glass down and studied Lucas carefully. "Look, I don't know who you are, and I don't care. Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it here." Lucas frowned, frustration bubbling up. "I'm not looking for anything, Then leave it alone," the man interrupted, his voice firm. He stood up, pulling cash from his pocket and tossing it onto the bar. "Good luck with whatever this is." Before Lucas could stop him, the man walked out, leaving Lucas sitting there with more questions than answers. When Lucas returned to the hotel, he found Ethan waiting for him in the lobby. "Where have you been?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with concern. "Just needed some air," Lucas replied casually. Though his mind was still racing from the encounter, Ethan studied him for a moment before nodding. "I get it. Tomorrow's another big day. Try to get some rest." Lucas nodded, though sleep was the last thing on his mind. The next morning, as they prepared to head back to Mr. Carter's property, Lucas decided to bring it up. "Dad," he began, keeping his tone casual, "have you ever heard of someone having a twin they didn't know about?" Ethan froze for a split second, but it was enough for Lucas to notice. "Why do you ask?" Ethan replied, his voice carefully neutral. Lucas shrugged, leaning back in his seat. "I don't know, just curious. I mean, imagine running into someone who looks exactly like you. Wouldn't that be wild?" Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly. "It's rare, but I suppose it could happen. Genetics can be strange sometimes." Lucas raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. His father's reaction only deepened his suspicion. Later that day, as they drove through the outskirts of town, Lucas spotted the stranger again, walking along the side of the road. Without thinking, he told Ethan to pull over. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, but Lucas was already out of the car. "Hey," Lucas called, jogging toward the man. "Wait," the stranger turned, his expression a mix of annoyance and resignation. "You again." "I'm not leaving this alone," Lucas said firmly. "I don't know what's going on, but I think we both know this isn't just some random coincidence." The man glanced at Ethan, who had stepped out of the car and was now staring at him with wide eyes. "Who's he?" the man asked, jerking his head toward Ethan. Lucas followed his gaze, then looked back at the stranger. "My dad." The man's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "Figures. What's that supposed to mean?" Lucas demanded. But before the man could respond, Ethan stepped forward. "Ryan?" Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger's eyes flickered with something unrecognizable. Shock, anger, and maybe even pain. "Don't call me that," he snapped before turning and walking away. Lucas stood frozen, the pieces starting to fall into place. "Dad," he said slowly, his voice shaking. "What's going on?" Ethan couldn't bring himself to answer. The truth, buried for so long, was finally clawing its way to the surface. The tension in the car on the drive back to the hotel was suffocating. Lucas sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring straight ahead. His usually relaxed demeanor was gone, replaced by a cold, determined silence. Ethan, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, struggled to find the words to explain. "Lucas," Ethan began, his voice tentative. "There's something you need to know." Lucas turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You don't say," he replied, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I just met someone who looks exactly like me, and you seem to know his name. I'd love to hear an explanation." Ethan sighed, his shoulders slumping as the weight of years of secrets pressed down on him. "I never wanted it to come out like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me from what?" Lucas snapped, his voice rising. "From the truth. From the fact that I apparently have a twin brother no one bothered to tell me about." Ethan pulled the car over to the side of the road, unable to focus on driving any longer. He turned to face Lucas, his eyes filled with guilt. "Ryan, he's your brother, your twin." Lucas's breath hitched. Hearing it said aloud was a blow he hadn't fully prepared for. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. "How could you hide something like this?" "We thought we were doing the right thing," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "When you were little, there was an incident. During the 4th of July festival, Ryan disappeared. We searched for him everywhere, but he was gone." Lucas's face twisted with disbelief. "You just gave up? You let my brother go and pretended he never existed?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "We never stopped looking for him. We hired private investigators, contacted every agency we could, but after months of searching, we had to face the reality that we might never find him. You were so young, Lucas. We thought it would hurt you less if you didn't know." Lucas shook his head, his mind racing. "So you lied to me. My entire life. You lied." Ethan reached for Lucas's shoulder, but Lucas recoiled. "I know it seems that way," Ethan said, his voice pleading. "But we did it out of love. We didn't want you to grow up with that pain." Lucas turned away, staring out the window. "Well, congratulations. You managed to keep me in the dark. But now I've met him, and he clearly doesn't want anything to do with me. Or you." Back at the hotel, Caroline was waiting for them in the lobby. She could sense the tension the moment they walked in, her motherly instincts kicking in immediately. "What happened?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Lucas shot Ethan a pointed look before walking past her without a word. Caroline turned to her husband, her brow furrowing. "Ethan, what's going on?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He knows, Caroline, about Ryan." Caroline's face paled. "How?" "We saw him," Ethan said, lowering his voice. "He's here, in Greenville. Lucas met him, and it all unraveled." Caroline sank into a nearby chair, her hand covering her mouth. "I never thought this day would come," she murmured. "What do we do now?" Ethan sat beside her, his expression grim. "We tell him everything. No more secrets. He deserves to know the truth." Later that evening, Lucas reluctantly joined his parents in their hotel suite. He sat on the couch, arms crossed, his face still etched with anger. Ethan and Caroline sat across from him, their faces filled with the weight of their shared guilt. Caroline was the first to speak. "Lucas, I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But please, just let us explain." Lucas didn't respond, his icy silence urging her to continue. "When you and Ryan were little, we took you to a festival," she began, her voice trembling. "It was crowded, and there was so much going on. One moment, Ryan was right there, holding my hand, and the next, he was gone. We looked for him everywhere," Ethan added. "The police, private investigators, even volunteers from the community. Everyone helped, but there was no sign of him. It was like he vanished into thin air." Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "We were devastated, Lucas. Losing him nearly destroyed us. But we didn't want you to carry that pain, so we made the decision to keep it from you." Lucas finally spoke, his voice low and full of bitterness. "So you just erased him, like he never existed." No, Ethan said quickly. We never erased him. We kept looking, even after we stopped telling people. But after years with no answers, we didn't know what else to do. Lucas shook his head, his emotions swirling between anger and heartbreak. And now, what am I supposed to do with this? He clearly hates me, or us. Caroline leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. He doesn't hate you, Lucas. He doesn't even know you. He's had a completely different life, one we can't begin to understand. But this is your chance to know him, to reconnect. Lucas met her gaze, his jaw tight. And what about him? What if he doesn't want to reconnect? Ethan sighed. That's a possibility we have to accept. But you deserve the chance to try. That night, as Lucas lay awake in his room, the weight of the truth settled over him. He had spent his entire life thinking he was an only child. But now, everything had changed. Somewhere out there was his brother, his twin, living a life Lucas couldn't begin to imagine. And for the first time, Lucas realized just how much he needed answers. Not just about Ryan, but about himself. The next morning, Lucas awoke with a restless determination. The shock and anger from the previous day hadn't subsided, but now they were mixed with a gnawing curiosity. His entire life had been built on a foundation of half-truths, and he was done being in the dark. He found Ethan sitting in the hotel lounge, coffee in hand, and a laptop open in front of him. The weariness on his father's face was unmistakable. Ethan looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. Lucas hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "Good morning," Lucas said, his tone measured but firm. Ethan glanced up, surprised by his son's calmness. "Morning, son. Sleep okay?" Lucas ignored the question, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "We need to find him, properly this time. No half measures." Ethan closed his laptop and leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "I agree. But Lucas, you need to understand something, Ryan. He's not the same little boy we lost. He's had a completely different life, and we don't know what he's been through." "I get that," Lucas replied, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "But he's still my brother. I need to know him. And I need to know why this happened." Ethan studied his son for a moment, then nodded. "I already have someone working on it." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Someone? A private investigator," Ethan explained. "I called him last night after we got back. He's one of the best. If Ryan's been living here, we'll know soon enough." Later that day, while waiting for news from the investigator, Lucas decided to take a drive through Greenville. He needed to clear his head, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that he might run into Ryan again. The town, though picturesque, felt small and close-knit. Surely it wouldn't be hard to find someone if you knew where to look. As he drove through the outskirts of town, his thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a familiar face. Ryan, or the man Lucas now knew as his brother, was walking along the side of the road, carrying a duffel bag. Without thinking, Lucas pulled over and got out of the car. "Ryan," he called, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the countryside. The man stopped but didn't turn around immediately. When he finally did, his face was a mixture of annoyance and resignation. "What do you want now?" Lucas approached cautiously, his hands raised slightly as if to show he meant no harm. "I just want to talk, please." Ryan narrowed his eyes, his stance defensive. "We don't have anything to talk about." "Yes, we do," Lucas insisted, his voice steady. "I know who you are, or at least, I know part of it, and I think you know who I am too." Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't walk away. Instead, he dropped his duffel bag and crossed his arms. "All right then, talk." Lucas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't know about you until yesterday. My parents, our parents, they never told me what happened. They thought it was better to protect me from the truth." Ryan let out a bitter laugh. "Protect you must have been nice growing up in your big house with your perfect life, while I got left behind." Lucas flinched at the venom in Ryan's voice. "I didn't know. Okay, I had no idea. But I want to fix this. I want to understand." "Fix it," Ryan repeated, his voice rising. "You can't fix this. You can't undo 20 years of being ignored and forgotten." "You weren't forgotten," Lucas said quickly. "I swear my parents searched for you. They never stopped." Ryan scoffed, shaking his head. "Sure doesn't feel that way." The tension between them was palpable. But Lucas refused to back down. "Look, I can't change the past, and I won't pretend to understand what you've been through, but you're my brother. That means something to me." Ryan's expression softened slightly, but the walls he had built around himself remained firmly in place. "You don't even know me." "Then let me," Lucas said earnestly. "Let me get to know you." For a moment, Ryan seemed to consider the offer. Then, with a sigh, he picked up his duffel bag. "I'm not making any promises, but if you want to talk, meet me at the diner on Main Street tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Lucas nodded, relief washing over him. "I'll be there." Ryan didn't say anything else. He turned and walked away, leaving Lucas standing by the side of the road with a strange mix of hope and apprehension. Back at the hotel, Lucas told Ethan and Caroline about the encounter. Caroline's eyes filled with tears as she listened, her hands clasped tightly together. "He agreed to talk?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Lucas replied. "Tomorrow morning?" Ethan placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder, his grip firm. "Be patient with him, he's been through a lot." Lucas nodded. "I know, but I think he's willing to give this a chance. That's all I can ask for." That night, Lucas lay awake in bed, his mind racing with possibilities. What would Ryan tell him? What kind of life had he lived? And most importantly, was there a way to rebuild the bond that had been broken so long ago? As the clock ticked past midnight, Lucas whispered into the darkness, "I'll make this right, somehow." The following morning, Lucas arrived at the diner on Main Street a little before 8. The modest retro-style diner smelled of coffee and sizzling bacon, and its large windows let in the early sunlight. Lucas chose a booth by the window, his heart racing with anticipation. The night had been restless, his mind replaying Ryan's words and trying to piece together a picture of the life his brother had lived. At exactly 8 o'clock, the bell above the door jingled, and Ryan walked in. He spotted Lucas immediately and approached the booth with a guarded expression. Without a word, he slid into the seat across from him, dropping his duffel bag beside him. "You're on time," Lucas said, trying to lighten the mood. "Don't push your luck," Ryan replied, though there was a faint hint of a smirk on his lips. A waitress approached, pouring coffee into the mugs in front of them. Ryan ordered a simple breakfast, eggs, toast, and sausage, while Lucas nervously asked for the same, despite not feeling hungry. When the waitress left, the silence between them was heavy. Lucas decided to dive in. "I want to know about you," he began. "Where you grew up, what your life was like, everything." Ryan leaned back, crossing his arms. "Why? So you can compare notes, see how much better your life was." "It's not like that," Lucas said quickly. I've spent my entire life not knowing you existed. Now that I do, I need to understand." Ryan studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Fine. You want the truth? I grew up on a farm outside Asheville. The people who raised me weren't bad, but they weren't exactly warm either. I wasn't their kid. I was just the kid they were stuck with." "Stuck with?" Lucas asked, frowning. "What does that mean?" Ryan hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "They didn't adopt me because they wanted to. They did it because some guy showed up one day with a sob story and handed me off to them, said my real family didn't want me." Lucas froze, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "Who was this guy?" "I don't know," Ryan said. "I barely remember him, but whoever he was, he made it clear I wasn't wanted." Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the waitress returned with their food. Ryan's tone shifted as he thanked her, but his expression remained tense. Later that day, Lucas recounted the conversation to Ethan and Caroline. The revelation about the mysterious man who had delivered Ryan to the farm sent shockwaves through the family. "This doesn't make sense," Caroline said, pacing the hotel room. "Who would take Ryan and just give him away like that?" Ethan sat in silence, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." He pulled out his phone and called the private investigator. "I need you to focus on a lead," he said. "A man who might have been involved in Ryan's disappearance. He would have been in the Asheville area about 20 years ago." "Understood," the investigator replied. "I'll start digging and get back to you as soon as I have something." The following day, the investigator called with his findings. "I've got something," he said. "There was a man, Raymond Carter, who worked as a driver for a wealthy family in Charleston around the time your son disappeared. He left town shortly after the incident and moved to Asheville. Records show he died in a car accident about 5 years ago. Carter, Ethan muttered, the name stirring a faint memory. I think I remember him. He worked for my uncle, Gerald. The mention of Gerald sent a chill through the room. Ethan's uncle had always been a shrewd and calculating man, fiercely protective of the family's wealth and reputation. You think he had something to do with this? Caroline asked, her voice trembling. Ethan's face darkened. It wouldn't surprise me. He never approved of us adopting the twins. He thought it would tarnish the family legacy. Lucas, standing nearby, felt a surge of anger. So what? He just decided to get rid of Ryan. How could anyone do something like that? Ethan stood, his jaw set. We need to confront him. That evening, the family drove back to Charleston to confront Gerald. The older man still lived in the sprawling Valenza estate, a place Lucas had rarely visited growing up. The house loomed large and imposing, its grandeur overshadowed by the tension in the air. Gerald greeted them in the parlor, his expression cool and composed. What brings you all here? He asked, sipping a glass of brandy. Ethan wasted no time. We know about Carter, he said, his voice sharp. And we know you were involved in Ryan's disappearance. Gerald raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Ethan snapped. Carter worked for you. He's the one who took Ryan to that farm in Asheville. Why? Gerald's expression hardened. You were making a mistake, bringing those boys into the family. It was reckless. I did what needed to be done, Caroline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Lucas felt his blood boil. You're telling me you ripped a child away from his family because of your ego, he demanded. I did it for the family, Gerald replied coldly. To protect our legacy. You destroyed our family, Ethan roared. You took our son and left him to grow up thinking he wasn't wanted. Gerald remained unmoved. What's done is done. Nothing you say will change that. Ethan took a step closer, his fists clenched. You'll pay for this, I'll make sure of it. Back at the hotel, Lucas sat in silence, replaying Gerald's words in his mind. The weight of the truth was overwhelming, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not yet. The ride back to the hotel was silent, tension filling the car like a thick fog. Lucas sat in the back seat, his hands clenched into fists. He had never felt anger like this before. A fiery, unrelenting rage directed at Gerald for what he had done. He had stolen Ryan's life and left scars that could never fully heal. Ethan, gripping the steering wheel tightly, broke the silence. This isn't over, he said, his voice low but firm. Gerald won't walk away from this. Caroline turned to him, her eyes wide with worry. Ethan, what are you going to do? He's a powerful man, if he's willing to do something this terrible to his own family. Who knows what else he's capable of? Ethan's jaw tightened. I don't care how powerful he is. He doesn't get to ruin our family and walk away like nothing happened. Lucas, sitting silently in the back, finally spoke. What about Ryan? Does he know any of this? Ethan shook his head. Not yet, but he will. Not. He deserves to know the truth. The next morning, Ethan called the private investigator again, determined to gather enough evidence to hold Gerald accountable. I need everything you can find on my uncle, he said. Any financial dealings, any connections to Carter, anything that can prove what he did. The investigator agreed and promised to report back within 24 hours. In the meantime, Ethan, Caroline, and Lucas began preparing to meet Ryan and share everything they had learned. At the diner on Main Street, Lucas sat nervously as he waited for Ryan to arrive. This time, Ethan and Caroline had come with him, though they agreed to stay outside and let Lucas speak to Ryan first. The plan was to ease Ryan into the conversation before revealing the full scope of what they had uncovered. When Ryan walked in, his expression was guarded as usual, but Lucas could sense the tension in his posture. You again? Ryan said as he slid into the booth across from Lucas. What's this about now? I found out more about what happened to you, Lucas said, his voice steady but soft. About how you ended up at that farm. Ryan's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Lucas took a deep breath. There was a man, Carter. He worked for someone in our family, our Uncle Gerald. He's the one who took you to Asheville. Ryan's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. And why would your uncle do that? Lucas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He didn't think you belonged in the family. He thought adopting you and me would tarnish the family legacy. Ryan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. So I wasn't even good enough to be thrown away by my own parents. It was your family's twisted idea of protecting their reputation. That's not true, Lucas said quickly. My parents didn't know. They thought you were gone. They never stopped looking for you. Ryan's gaze softened slightly, though the anger in his eyes didn't fade entirely. And what now? What am I supposed to do with this information? I don't know, Lucas admitted. But I thought you deserved to know. And I want you to meet them. My parents. Our parents. Ryan raised an eyebrow. And what makes you think they'll want to meet me after all this time? They've wanted this for 20 years, Lucas said, his voice filled with conviction. Please, just give them a chance. Ryan didn't respond immediately. His expression conflicted. Finally, he sighed. Fine, but don't expect me to roll out a welcome mat. Ethan and Caroline were waiting outside the diner, their faces a mixture of hope and trepidation. When Ryan stepped out with Lucas, Caroline immediately covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Ryan, she whispered, her voice breaking. Ryan looked at her, his expression guarded but curious. You must be Caroline, he said, his tone cautious. Caroline nodded, unable to speak as she stepped forward. Ethan, standing beside her, extended a hand. Ryan, I'm Ethan, your father. Ryan hesitated, then shook Ethan's hand briefly. So, you're the ones who didn't tell me I existed? Ethan's face fell. We thought we were protecting you, he said. But we were wrong. We should have fought harder. Ryan shrugged, his face unreadable. You did what you thought was best, doesn't mean it was right. Caroline wiped her eyes and stepped closer. Ryan, I can't tell you how sorry we are. We never stopped looking for you, and now that we've found you, we just want to make things right. Ryan's gaze softened, though he remained wary. Let's take this one step at a time. That evening, the family sat together at the hotel, talking for hours. Ryan shared pieces of his life, how he had grown up feeling out of place, how he had struggled to trust people. Ethan and Caroline listened intently, their guilt evident in every word they spoke. Lucas, sitting beside Ryan, felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, it felt like they were moving toward healing. But the peace was short-lived. Ethan's phone buzzed, and when he answered, the investigator's voice was urgent. Ethan, I found something. Gerald's been involved in some shady deals. But more importantly, he's been covering up his connection to Carter. I have enough evidence to prove what he did to Ryan. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. Good. Send me everything. When he hung up, Ethan turned to his family. We have what we need to confront Gerald. This ends now. The next morning, the Valenza family gathered in their hotel suite. The air was heavy with tension as Ethan laid out the plan to confront Gerald. Lucas paced the room. Unable to hide his frustration, Ryan sat on the couch, arms crossed. His expression a mixture of anger and exhaustion. You're telling me this guy just gets to live his life after what he did to me? Ryan asked, his voice sharp. After throwing me away like I was nothing. Not if I can help it, Ethan replied, his tone firm. Gerald may think he's untouchable, but this evidence changes everything. Once we confront him, the truth will come out, and he'll face the consequences. Caroline placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. We're going to make this right, she said softly. For you. Ryan glanced at her, his defenses lowering just slightly. I've heard a lot of promises in my life. Let's see if this one sticks. The Valenzas drove to Gerald's estate, a sprawling mansion that loomed like a fortress on the outskirts of Charleston. Ryan hadn't been back to Charleston since he was a child. Not that he had any memory of it, but the sight of the grand estate stirred something unfamiliar in him. A strange mix of curiosity and resentment. As they approached the front door, Ethan turned to his family. Let me handle this, he said, his voice low but commanding. Gerald's manipulative. He'll try to twist this to his advantage. No, Ryan interrupted, his voice steady. I'm not sitting on the sidelines for this. He needs to hear from me. Ethan hesitated but nodded, respecting his son's resolve. Together, they walked into the estate, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls. Gerald greeted them in the parlor, seated in a leather armchair with a glass of brandy in hand. His face betrayed no emotion as he glanced at the group. "Back so soon," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "What is it this time?" Ethan didn't waste time. "We know what you did," he said, his voice sharp. "You had Carter take Ryan to that farm. You ripped him away from his family." Gerald leaned back, feigning indifference. "And that was a long time ago. Do you think anyone cares about ancient history?" "I care," Ryan said, stepping forward. His voice was calm but laced with steel. "You ruined my life. You made me think I wasn't wanted, that I didn't belong anywhere. You don't get to shrug that off." Gerald's expression flickered with something. Surprise? Perhaps, but it quickly hardened. "You're lucky, boy. If I hadn't stepped in, who knows what kind of mess you'd be in now. I saved this family from disgrace." "You didn't save anything," Lucas shot back, his anger boiling over. "You destroyed it. You destroyed him." Ethan held up a folder, filled with the evidence the investigator had gathered. "This says otherwise. I have everything I need to expose you. Your involvement with Carter, your shady financial dealings, all of it. If you think you can walk away from this, you're wrong." Gerald's face darkened, the calm mask slipping for the first time. "You think you can threaten me? I've built this family. Without me, none of you would have anything. You didn't build this family," Caroline said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Families aren't built on power or money. They're built on love, trust, and doing the right thing. You've destroyed everything that mattered, and now you'll answer for it." The confrontation escalated, voices rising as years of anger and betrayal came spilling out. Ryan stood firm, his words cutting like a knife as he finally unleashed the pain he had carried for so long. Gerald, for all his bravado, began to crumble under the weight of the truth. Ethan made his final move. "You have two options," he said coldly. "Either you step down from the family business and disappear quietly, or I take this evidence public. Believe me, the world will know exactly what kind of man you are." Gerald stared at Ethan, his face pale. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. "Fine," he spat. "Take your victory, but don't think for a second this makes you better than me." Ethan didn't respond, his gaze steady as Gerald stormed out of the room. After the confrontation, the family gathered in the estate's garden, the tension slowly giving way to relief. Ryan leaned against a stone bench, his arms crossed as he stared at the sprawling property. "So, that's it?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "He's just gone. For now," Ethan said, sitting beside him. "But we'll keep an eye on him. If he tries anything, we'll be ready." Caroline approached Ryan, her eyes filled with warmth. "You stood up to him," she said softly. "That took strength." Ryan shrugged, his gaze distant. "Doesn't feel like enough." "It is," Lucas said, stepping forward. "You're here, Ryan. That's what matters." Ryan met his brother's eyes, the walls between them finally starting to crack. "I guess I owe you for dragging me into this mess." Lucas grinned. "You're welcome." That night, back at the hotel, Ryan sat with Ethan and Caroline, their conversation quieter but no less significant. They spoke about the years they had lost, the pain they had endured, and the hope they still held for the future. For the first time, Ryan began to see them not as strangers, but as parents, flawed, human, and deeply regretful. Lucas joined them, sitting beside Ryan. "So," he said, breaking the heavy silence. "What's next?" Ryan smirked faintly. "I guess I stick around, at least until I figure out what to do with all this family drama." Lucas laughed. "Welcome to the club." As the night wore on, the Valenzas found something they hadn't felt in a long time. Unity, though the scars of the past would never fully fade. They had taken their first steps toward healing, and for now, that was enough. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the hotel suite, casting a warm glow over the room where the Valenzas had gathered for breakfast. The tension of the previous days had eased, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. Ryan sat at the table, sipping coffee as he listened to Ethan and Caroline discuss plans for the future. Lucas, as usual, added his quick wit to the conversation, lightening the mood. For the first time, Ryan didn't feel like an outsider. He still had questions. Years of pain and abandonment couldn't be erased overnight, but he was beginning to see a place for himself in this family. It was a feeling he hadn't expected, and wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. Later that day, the family returned to Charleston to visit the estate that had once symbolized everything Ryan had been denied. Ethan had suggested the visit as a way to reconnect with the past while forging a new path forward. Caroline had spent the car ride nervously twisting her hands, but Ryan appeared calm, his face unreadable as they approached the grand gates. Inside, the house was quiet, its grandeur muted in the absence of Gerald. "It feels different," Caroline murmured as they walked through the halls. "Lighter." Somehow, Ryan lingered in the parlor, his eyes scanning the room. "This is where you grew up?" he asked Lucas. "Pretty much," Lucas replied, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "It was great as a kid, but it's a little overwhelming now." Ryan nodded, his gaze drifting to the ornate fireplace. He couldn't help but wonder what his life would have been like if he'd grown up here. Would he have been happier, more secure, or would he have felt just as out of place? As they walked through the estate, Ethan led them to a small sitting room where family photos lined the walls. Ryan paused in front of one picture, a photo of Ethan and Caroline holding Lucas as a baby. His jaw tightened as he studied the image. The happiness on their faces a stark contrast to the struggles of his own childhood. Caroline noticed and stepped beside him. "We always wanted this to be a picture of the four of us," she said softly. "We kept looking for you, hoping one day we'd be able to bring you home and make it whole." Ryan glanced at her, his expression guarded. "It's hard to picture myself in something like this. It doesn't feel real." "It can be," Caroline said, her voice steady, "if you let it." Ryan looked back at the photo, his walls slowly beginning to crumble. "Maybe," he said quietly. That evening, the family gathered in the estate's garden for dinner. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the table. The meal was simple but heartfelt, a reflection of their shared determination to rebuild. Ethan raised his glass, his voice filled with emotion as he spoke. "To Ryan," he said, looking directly at his son. "To finding you, to bringing you home, and to the future we're going to build together." Ryan hesitated, then lifted his own glass. "To second chances," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Lucas grinned. "And to finally having someone to share the blame when Mom gets mad." The table erupted in laughter, the sound breaking through the lingering tension like a ray of light. For the first time, Ryan felt the faint stirrings of belonging, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could fit into this puzzle after all. In the days that followed, Ryan began to spend more time with his family, gradually letting down his guard. Lucas, ever the optimist, took it upon himself to show Ryan around Charleston, introducing him to places that had shaped his childhood. They explored the waterfront, visited local markets, and even took a detour to Lucas's favorite burger joint. "I'm surprised you're not some uptight rich kid," Ryan teased as they sat by the water. Their burgers in hand, Lucas smirked. "Give it time. I can be insufferable when I want to be." Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "You're not so bad, I guess." "Thanks," Lucas said, grinning. "You're not so bad yourself." Meanwhile, Ethan and Caroline worked on integrating Ryan into their lives more fully. They offered him a place to stay at the estate, though Ryan was hesitant to accept. "I'm not sure I'm ready for all this," he said, gesturing to the grand house. "It's not about the house," Ethan replied. "It's about family, and you'll always have a place here no matter what." Caroline nodded, her eyes filled with warmth. "We don't want to rush you, Ryan. Take your time, but know that this is your home too." Ryan didn't respond immediately, but their words lingered with him as he considered what his future might look like. The final piece of closure came when Ryan decided to visit the gravesite of the couple who had raised him. Though their relationship had been complicated, he felt it was important to acknowledge the role they had played in his life. Standing by their modest headstones, Ryan spoke softly. "I don't know if you ever really wanted me, but you gave me a roof over my head when no one else did. For that, I'm grateful." When he returned to the estate that evening, Lucas greeted him with a grin. "You ready to officially move in?" Ryan smirked. "We'll see. Don't get too comfortable." As the weeks passed, the Valenzas began to feel like a family again. Imperfect, but undeniably whole. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined them. Instead, they became a testament to their resilience, a reminder of how far they had come. One evening, as they sat on the estate's patio, Lucas turned to Ryan. "So, what's next for you?" Ryan shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Guess I'll stick around for a bit, see how this family thing works out." Lucas clinked his glass against Ryan's. "Here's to second chances." Ryan nodded, his gaze sweeping over the family that had fought so hard to find him. "To second chances," he echoed, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.